The morning air over the banks of the Hydaspes river was thick with tension and the promise of blood. The river's waters, swollen by seasonal rains, roared as they twisted and turned through the fertile plains of what is now modern-day Punjab. On the far side, a formidable army waited, its banners snapping in the wind, the scent of dust and sweat hanging heavy in the air. King Porus, proud and resolute, rode along the lines of his soldiers, the weight of his royal attire and the gleaming armor of his companions, marking him as a man both of courage and of authority. His gaze swept over the ranks of infantry, cavalry, and war elephants, measuring their strength, their discipline, their readiness. Each elephant, armored and massive, trumpeted challenges that echoed across the river, sending shivers down the spines of those who heard. On the opposite bank, Alexander of Macedon surveyed the scene with the cool intensity of a general who had never known fear. The young conqueror, barely in his late 20s, had already carved a path across the known world, defeating armies larger than his own and bending kingdoms to his will. His eyes, sharp and calculating, watched the glint of Porus's armor, the movement of his cavalry, the discipline of the phalanx formations. The Macedonian army, seasoned and loyal, stood in tight formations, the long sarissas in their hands catching the morning light. Soldiers adjusted their shields, archers nocked arrows, and the sound of armor clinking and leather creaking filled the air. The river itself presented a formidable obstacle. Its waters were swift, and the banks were steep and muddy in places. Alexander understood that a frontal assault would be perilous, even for his well-drilled troops. He had spent nights studying the river, calculating the points where it could be forded, the likely locations of enemy observation, and the tactical advantage of surprise. To cross it would require not just courage, but cunning, a demonstration of strategy that had become Alexander's signature. As the sun rose higher, reflecting off the rippling water, Alexander signaled to his generals. Orders moved swiftly, transmitted through shouted commands, hand signals, and the clatter of horse hooves. Porus, aware of Alexander's reputation, anticipated boldness. He had trained his men to hold their ground, to withstand assaults, and to fight with the ferocity of their king. The elephants, a weapon both psychological and physical, were positioned in the front lines. Their massive bodies, armored and towering above men and horses alike, were trained to charge with deadly precision. The cavalry flanked the elephants, their riders armed with spears and bows, ready to exploit any breach in the Macedonian ranks. Infantry, holding large shields and spears, formed a solid wall behind the elephants, ready to protect the king and ensure that the line would not break. Porus's plan relied on the weight of his force, the shock of his elephants, and the discipline of his soldiers to overwhelm anyone who dared to cross into his territory. As Alexander prepared his crossing, the soldiers murmured among themselves. Some were anxious, aware of the river's dangers and the might of the Indian army that awaited them. Others, hardened by years of campaigning across Persia, Thrace, and the lands of the East, remained confident, trusting in their commander's brilliance. Alexander moved among them briefly, a reassuring presence, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His charisma and courage had inspired these men to follow him across deserts, through mountain passes, and into the heart of enemy lands. Today would be another test, a testament to their skill and their loyalty. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander made his move. Small detachments of troops crossed the river at different points, using hidden fords and shallow channels. The sound of oars splashing, the whisper of leather boots on wet ground, and the muted calls of commanders marked the quiet advance. Porus, confident in the natural barrier of the Hydaspes, did not anticipate the swiftness and audacity of the Macedonian maneuver. By the early morning, sections of Alexander's army had secured positions on the near bank, forming a bridgehead for the main assault. When the battle finally erupted, it did so with the roar of elephants and the clash of steel. Porus's war elephants surged forward, their tusks and armored foreheads smashing into the first lines of Macedonian infantry. The ground shook with each step, dust rising in clouds as men and horses alike struggled to maintain formation. Alexander's phalanx met the elephants with a combination of discipline and ingenuity. Soldiers thrust their long spears into the flanks of the charging beasts, while others focused on cutting at the legs, trying to destabilize them. Cavalry units circled, striking where the elephant columns were weakest, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. Amid the turmoil, Alexander remained at the center, directing his forces with precision. He knew the key to victory lay in neutralizing the elephants without breaking his lines. Skirmishers threw javelins and shot arrows, targeting both riders and beasts. Macedonian engineers and tacticians, prepared for such contingencies, had devised wedges and spikes to disrupt the elephant charges. Slowly, methodically, the balance began to shift. Elephant after elephant was brought down, their riders unseated, their terrifying advance slowed. The disciplined Macedonian phalanx held firm, absorbing the shock and pressing forward. Porus, witnessing the faltering of his elephants, rode among his men, rallying them with shouts and gestures. His bravery was unmatched. Even as the line wavered, he stood tall, issuing commands, encouraging his soldiers to fight with every ounce of their strength. His spear flashed in the sunlight, a symbol of defiance, as he challenged Macedonian units to close combat. The king's presence inspired those around him, even as the odds grew increasingly unfavorable. Yet Alexander, recognizing the importance of striking decisively, directed his cavalry to outflank the Indian forces, cutting off retreat routes and isolating sections of the army. The battle raged through the day, a brutal contest of endurance, strategy, and sheer force. Dust and smoke hung in the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded and the roar of the river. Soldiers fought with desperation, knowing that surrender meant death or capture. Arrows flew in arcs, swords clashed in brutal duels, and the ground became slippery with blood and mud. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, step by step, slowly turning the tide. Porus, despite his valor, found his forces increasingly pressed, his lines bending but not yet breaking. His elephants, fewer now and weary from combat, struggled against the relentless discipline of Alexander's men. By late afternoon, the Macedonians had gained significant ground. Key positions were captured, and Porus's army began to fragment under the pressure of coordinated attacks. Yet the Indian king refused to yield. Mounted on his remaining elephant, he inspired one final charge, striking at the heart of the Macedonian formation. The clash was ferocious, a whirlwind of tusks, steel, and human resolve. Alexander himself engaged in the midst, coordinating movements, redirecting units, exploiting every weakness in the enemy's defense. The fight between the two leaders, though indirect, defined the battlefield, a clash of ambition, skill, and courage that would be remembered for centuries. Eventually, the resilience of Porus could not overcome the tactical brilliance and relentless discipline of Alexander's forces. The remaining elephants were driven back or killed, the cavalry scattered, and the infantry overwhelmed. Yet Alexander, recognizing the courage and nobility of his opponent, chose not to execute Porus. Instead, he approached the fallen king, offering terms of alliance and respect. Porus, though defeated, accepted, his dignity intact. Alexander's magnanimity ensured that Porus retained his kingdom as a satrap under Macedonian oversight, a strategic and political victory as much as a military one. The aftermath of the battle was marked by reflection as much as celebration. Alexander's army had proven once again the superiority of discipline, strategy, and leadership. Porus, though defeated, had demonstrated courage, resilience, and the formidable might of his army, leaving an impression that would endure in the annals of history. The Hydaspes River, which had witnessed such carnage, flowed on, a silent witness to the clash of two great leaders. Soldiers on both sides tended to the wounded, collected the dead, and began the arduous task of regrouping and rebuilding. News of the battle spread quickly across the region, reaching distant lands and inspiring tales of heroism and audacity. The legend of Alexander crossing of the Hydaspes and his engagement with the mighty Porus would echo through generations, a story of strategy, courage, and the complex interplay of conquest and respect. The river, the plains, and the battlefield itself became symbols of the clash of civilizations, of ambition meeting valor, and of the human capacity for both destruction and honor.